The morning after the ducal wedding dawned pale and unkind, its light slipping through the tall windows of Ashbourne House as though uncertain it was welcome. London had not yet finished celebrating, yet already it had begun to whisper. In drawing-rooms still scented with last night's flowers, ladies leaned close and murmured of the bride who smiled too little, of the groom whose courtesy felt like distance. Carriages rattled past the great house carrying speculation more swiftly than fact, and servants moved with careful faces, sensing that something delicate had cracked beneath the splendor. The bells had rung, the vows had been spoken, and the Duke of Ashbourne had claimed a wife, yet the air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for proof that the marriage was more than a performance arranged for the comfort of others. She had entered the union knowing affection was not promised, but ignorance is gentler than knowledge, and the truth had been delivered to her with exquisite restraint. He spoke to her not as a husband might, but as a man trained to govern himself before all else. His voice was calm, his words measured, when he informed her that separate bedchambers had been prepared, and that she should not expect him to cross the threshold of hers that night. There was no cruelty in his tone, only resolve, which made the moment sharper still. She inclined her head and thanked him, because dignity was the last possession she could claim without permission, and she would not surrender it to shock. The Duke of Ashbourne had been desired long before he was loved, a distinction he understood all too well. His title carried land, influence, and an inheritance bound by law so unforgiving that a single misstep could scatter centuries of power. Entailment hovered over his estate like a silent executioner, and the crown's interest in his loyalty pressed upon him with polite insistence. Marriage, for him, was not romance but defense, a structure erected to hold back loss. He had chosen his Duchess not for beauty alone, though she possessed it quietly, but for her suitability, her unremarkable family history unmarred by scandal, her intelligence concealed beneath modest manners. He told himself this choice was merciful, that distance would spare her disappointment and himself weakness. She, newly become Duchess, moved through the corridors of her new home with careful steps, as though the house itself might judge her. The servants bowed, the housekeeper deferred, and yet none of it felt real, because it had not been earned through intimacy but granted through ceremony. Alone in her chamber, she removed her jewels one by one, each glittering token of celebration transformed into an emblem of irony. She did not cry, not because she was unhurt, but because tears felt like a language she refused to speak aloud. Instead, she sat by the window and watched the city awaken, wondering how many eyes already imagined her humiliation with satisfaction. By breakfast, the rumors had found shape. A cousin's raised brow, a lady's careful silence, a valet's averted gaze, all confirmed that London sensed the absence at the heart of the marriage. The Duke presided at the table with impeccable manners, asking after her comfort, commenting on the weather, never once acknowledging the gulf between them. To any observer, they were harmonious, even enviable. Only in the stillness between courses did the truth reveal itself, in the way his hand never sought hers, in the formality that replaced tenderness before it could be missed. She answered him with equal composure, her voice steady, her posture flawless, determined that if she must endure scrutiny, she would offer nothing that could be used against her. The cruelty of their arrangement lay not in isolation, but in visibility. She was expected to appear, to smile, to accept congratulations for a happiness she did not possess. Each visit paid, each invitation extended, reinforced the role she must perform. The Duke, observing her from a distance he had imposed, felt a tightening in his chest he refused to name. He had believed separation would preserve order, yet already he sensed disorder blooming quietly within himself. Her restraint unsettled him more than reproach ever could, for it denied him the comfort of believing her weak or dependent upon his regard. That afternoon, as the household settled into its rhythms, she was escorted through the estate, introduced to responsibilities she would be expected to manage. Accounts, charities, tenant concerns, all were placed before her with the assumption she would comply, perhaps even be grateful. She listened, asked precise questions, and committed each detail to memory. If she could not claim his affection, she would claim her purpose. The Duke observed this from the margins, struck by the ease with which she inhabited her role, and by the faint sense that he had underestimated her resolve. It was an unsettling realization, one he suppressed beneath protocol. By evening, the city's speculation had sharpened into certainty. A duchess alone on her wedding night was a story too delicious to resist, and it spread with merciless efficiency. She knew it as surely as if it had been spoken aloud, yet she met the night with quiet resolve. Standing before the mirror, she removed the final traces of ceremony and regarded herself without illusion. She had entered a marriage bound by duty and emerged determined not to be undone by it. Somewhere beyond her door, the Duke walked his own chambers, convinced restraint was protection, unaware that distance, once chosen, has a way of demanding a reckoning far greater than desire. The days following the wedding settled into a rhythm as formal as the tolling of a clock, each hour measured, each interaction restrained. Ashbourne House revealed itself slowly, its long corridors echoing with footsteps that rarely met, its vast rooms warmed by fires that did little to soften the distance between Duke and Duchess. At meals, they spoke of estate matters and public obligations, their words polished and impersonal, yet beneath the surface a quiet awareness began to form. He noticed how she listened more than she spoke, how she absorbed details others overlooked, and how she never once alluded to the solitude that society so eagerly imagined. She, in turn, observed him with the careful attention of a woman who understood power but refused to fear it. The Duke moved through his domain with practiced authority, issuing instructions, receiving reports, bearing the weight of expectation with a composure that bordered on severity. Yet there were moments, brief and unguarded, when his gaze lingered on a window or a ledger, as though his thoughts had wandered somewhere he would not allow himself to go. She did not challenge him, but she learned him, sensing that his restraint was less indifference than armor forged long before she entered his life. It was on the fourth morning that the first token appeared, subtle enough to be dismissed as practicality. A note, written in his precise hand, informed her that the estate library was now entirely at her disposal, its catalogue and keys entrusted to her management. No explanation accompanied the gesture, no acknowledgement of its significance, yet she understood it as an offering of trust. The library was the heart of Ashbourne's legacy, housing records, correspondence, and volumes inherited across generations. To grant her such access was no small concession, and she accepted it with a composed nod that concealed her quiet satisfaction. Within those walls, she found purpose. She spent hours reviewing accounts and tenant petitions, discovering inefficiencies long tolerated out of habit. When she presented her findings, she did so without presumption, framing her observations as questions rather than demands. The Duke listened, initially with polite detachment, then with growing interest as he realized the precision of her mind. Each exchange shifted something imperceptible between them, a recalibration that neither named. He approved several of her suggestions, remarking only that her diligence was appreciated, yet the acknowledgement lingered longer than praise. Society, however, was less generous in its assessments. Invitations arrived edged with curiosity, and when they attended a ball given in their honor, the scrutiny was relentless. Chandeliers blazed, music swelled, and gowns shimmered beneath the weight of expectation. The Duchess moved with quiet grace, answering compliments with restraint, while whispers followed her steps like shadows. The Duke danced once with her, fulfilling obligation, his hand steady at her waist, his expression unreadable. To observers, the dance appeared proper, even affectionate, but she felt the tension in his stillness, the careful distance he maintained even in closeness. The scandal arrived not with noise, but with implication. A careless remark overheard near the refreshment table suggested the marriage had been arranged under duress, that the Duchess's position was precarious, her influence nominal. The words reached her through a sympathetic glance rather than direct accusation, and she felt the familiar sting of humiliation sharpened by injustice. She did not retreat. Instead, she lifted her chin and continued through the evening with unwavering composure, determined that no rumor would see her diminished. The Duke, alerted to the insult, responded in a manner that startled them both. He sought out the speaker, addressed the insinuation with cool authority, and reminded the assembly that the Duchess's rank and respect were beyond question. The exchange was brief, decisive, and unmistakably public. For the first time, society witnessed not indifference, but defense. She watched from across the room, her breath caught between surprise and something dangerously close to gratitude. When his gaze met hers, it held for a moment longer than courtesy required, then released. The aftermath of the evening left them unsettled. Back at Ashbourne House, silence pressed heavier than before, charged with unspoken meaning. He retreated to his study, questioning the impulse that had driven him to intervene, while she returned to her chamber, aware that the boundary between them had shifted. The next day, another token appeared, this time less easily dismissed. He entrusted her with overseeing a charitable endowment long managed by his family, granting her authority that extended beyond the household into the wider community. With each responsibility assumed, her confidence grew, and with it, the household's quiet allegiance. Servants deferred, tenants expressed gratitude, and the estate began to reflect her influence. The Duke observed these changes with a mixture of admiration and unease, realizing that her presence had altered the balance he had so carefully preserved. Distance, he discovered, did not diminish attachment. It refined it, sharpening awareness into something both restrained and persistent. As autumn advanced, whispers persisted, but they were no longer unchallenged. Society sensed a complexity it could not fully penetrate, and speculation grew more cautious. The Duchess, once pitied, was now regarded with curiosity, even respect. Yet beneath the surface, the marriage remained unresolved, its silence louder than any rumor. One evening, as they crossed paths in the corridor, he paused as though to speak, then thought better of it, leaving her with the echo of possibility and the certainty that restraint, once tested, rarely remains unbroken. The storm arrived without ceremony, rolling across the estate with a wind that rattled windows and unsettled tempers. By dusk the sky had darkened into a bruise, and Ashbourne House seemed to draw inward, corridors hushed, servants retreating early. The Duchess lingered in the library, candles lit, finishing correspondence she refused to abandon to anxiety. Thunder followed thoughtlessly, close and impatient, until a sudden report split the air and extinguished two flames. She did not cry out, yet the silence afterward felt accusatory, as though the house itself demanded acknowledgment of what had been avoided too long by everyone present. He found her there moments later, summoned by the storm yet halted by the sight of her solitary concentration. For a breath they regarded one another, the library holding them in suspended intimacy. He apologized for the darkness, though both understood it was not merely light that had failed. She accepted the apology with a nod, remarking calmly upon the weather's insistence. The thunder returned, closer, and with it the awareness that this enforced proximity could not be dismissed as accident. He closed the door against the noise, an act enough to seem necessary, significant enough to alter the evening. They stood separated by a table strewn with maps and ledgers, symbols of the life they shared without sharing each other. The storm pressed nearer, rain striking glass with insistence, until he spoke her name, quietly, without title. The sound startled them both. He confessed that the silence between them had become unbearable, that restraint no longer felt like virtue but cowardice. She listened without interruption, her expression steady, though her hands tightened together. When he faltered, she asked whether his distance had ever truly been for her protection, or merely for his own fear, which he could not deny. The question struck deeper than accusation, and he answered it with honesty long deferred. He spoke of inheritance bound by law, of a crown impatient for heirs, of a past attachment destroyed by ambition and consequence. Loving her, he believed, would endanger them both, exposing her to political cruelty he could not shield her from. As he spoke, the storm softened, rain easing into a steady hush. She did not console him, nor did she rebuke him. Instead she told him, with quiet firmness, that protection chosen without consent becomes another form of imprisonment within marriage itself, always, and duty. Her words unsettled him because they rang with truth he had avoided. He had measured honor by endurance, not by courage, and now that measure felt insufficient. She admitted, in turn, that she had feared becoming invisible, reduced to a title that required gratitude rather than belonging. The admission was not a plea, but a statement of worth. Outside, the storm withdrew, leaving the night washed and expectant. In that calm, they recognized something fragile forming, not yet love spoken aloud, but understanding, newly earned and easily lost if mishandled by either of them, tonight, alone, uncertain, waiting, silently, still. They did not cross the space between them, though it seemed to narrow of its own accord. Instead, they spoke until the hour grew late, exchanging histories and reflections previously withheld by courtesy. He listened as she described a life shaped by observation rather than indulgence, by patience learned early. She learned of his youth spent preparing for burdens he never chose. Each confession stripped formality away, leaving respect transformed into something warmer, more dangerous. When the clock chimed, he stepped back, acknowledging the boundary they still shared, yet promising it would not remain unexamined much longer, by choice, again. When he left, the library felt altered, as though memory had been written into its walls. She extinguished the candles slowly, aware that solitude no longer meant abandonment. For the first time since the wedding, she allowed herself a breath of hope, cautious yet undeniable. In his chamber, he stood at the window, wrestling with a resolve he could no longer sustain. Distance had failed to protect them, silence had failed to heal him. What remained was decision, and the knowledge that delay would cost them more than action ever could demand from both hearts, soon, openly, bravely, irrevocably, together. The following days carried a new undercurrent, subtle but persistent. Their exchanges grew less guarded, their silences less oppressive. At meals, his attention lingered, and she met it without retreat. The household sensed the change, though no one named it. Yet the world beyond Ashbourne remained poised to intrude, and expectation pressed closer with every passing hour. The Crown's interest, patient yet implacable, would not be satisfied by understanding alone. Both knew that confession, once made, demands consequence. The storm had passed, but its reckoning approached with steady inevitability, testing them, quietly, publicly, soon, enough, to shatter illusions, again, entirely. She prepared herself for that reckoning with deliberate calm, knowing dignity would be her shield whatever followed. He, meanwhile, found his thoughts returning to her with increasing insistence, her voice echoing where command once ruled. The marriage, conceived as defense, now demanded courage he had long postponed. Each glance exchanged carried weight, each pause an invitation fraught with risk. Though nothing outward had changed, everything essential had. They stood upon the threshold of transformation, aware that retreat was no longer possible without betraying the truth they had uncovered together in storm-lit honesty and mutual recognition, still, quietly, binding them forward. The night closed with unanswered questions, yet also with resolve newly forged. When they parted, there was no return to former distance, only a measured patience charged with intent. Love remained unspoken, but it had ceased to be impossible. Beyond the windows, clouds broke apart, revealing a thin scatter of stars, uncertain yet enduring. Within those walls, two lives long governed by restraint prepared for the consequences of choosing truth over safety. The silence that followed was no longer empty, but expectant, promising that what began in denial would soon demand declaration from both hearts, publicly, bravely, without regret, ahead. Morning arrived with deliberate clarity, as though the world itself demanded resolution. The Duchess rose early, composed yet resolute, aware that the understanding forged between them could not remain private without consequence. Ashbourne House stirred with restrained anticipation, servants attentive, corridors alive with rumor subdued by discretion. She dressed with care, choosing simplicity over display, not to diminish herself, but to remind herself who she had been before the title and who she remained beneath it. Dignity, she had learned, was not granted by marriage, but revealed by conduct under scrutiny. The Duke awaited her in the small morning room overlooking the eastern lawns, its windows open to pale sunlight and dew-bright grass. When she entered, he rose without hesitation, a gesture that carried intention rather than courtesy. They spoke first of trivialities, of weather and correspondence, until pretense grew tiresome. He asked her to sit, then surprised himself by doing the same, placing them at equal height, an unconscious correction of old habits. The silence between them was not empty, but weighted with choice, each aware that what followed would shape not only their marriage, but their standing before the world. He spoke plainly, abandoning the careful evasions that had defined him. He told her that restraint had failed, that fear had disguised itself as honor, and that he would no longer allow duty to excuse absence. If the marriage was to stand, it would do so openly, acknowledged not merely in law, but in life. She listened, neither triumphant nor softened, but attentive to the sincerity she now recognized. When he finished, she answered with measured clarity, stating that she would accept nothing offered in halves. She would not be a duchess hidden behind formality, nor a wife claimed only in private. Their accord, once reached, demanded action. That afternoon, the Duke summoned his solicitor and his closest family, informing them that the marriage would be presented as it truly was, without apology. Resistance followed, cloaked in concern, yet he did not retreat. The Duchess observed quietly, noting how resolve altered him, sharpening his authority into something more humane. When objections ceased, not because they were resolved but because they were futile, she felt a cautious admiration take root. Courage, she realized, was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to allow it command. The declaration was made not through spectacle, but presence. At a formal reception held days later, the Duke remained at her side without distance or reserve. He addressed her as his wife with unmistakable warmth, sought her counsel openly, and invited her opinion where once he spoke alone. Society noticed immediately. Whispers shifted, confusion giving way to reassessment. The Duchess met every gaze with calm assurance, neither defensive nor eager, allowing her bearing to speak where words would invite misinterpretation. By evening's end, doubt had given way to reluctant acceptance, then to something resembling respect. Private acknowledgment followed public resolve. That night, he stood before her chamber not as a man fulfilling obligation, but as one seeking permission. She granted it without words, stepping aside to allow him entry. What passed between them was marked not by haste, but by reverence, a recognition that intimacy earned carries weight beyond desire. In the shared quiet afterward, they spoke of nothing remarkable, yet everything essential was understood. The space that once divided them had been crossed not by impulse, but by intention, and neither mistook that crossing as an ending. Days unfolded with a steadiness that surprised them both. Shared responsibilities became collaboration, conversation replaced assumption, and the estate reflected their union through harmony rather than command. Challenges persisted, political and social, yet they faced them together, presenting a united front that discouraged intrusion. The Duchess's influence grew visible, her judgment trusted, her presence no longer questioned. The Duke found that leadership shared did not diminish him, but refined him, easing a burden he had long borne alone without admitting its weight. In time, the crown's interest was satisfied not by heirs promised, but by stability demonstrated. The marriage, once suspect, became exemplary in its quiet strength. London adjusted its narrative, favoring admiration over scandal, though memory of the earlier whispers lingered as cautionary reminder. The Duchess never forgot them, nor did she allow them to harden her. Instead, she regarded them as evidence of what endurance without bitterness could achieve. The Duke, observing her grace, understood at last that love, when chosen, is not indulgence, but commitment made visible. One evening, months later, they walked the eastern lawns together as dusk settled, the house behind them glowing with lamplight. He spoke of the future without hesitation, including her as naturally as breath. She listened, aware that fulfillment had arrived not as a sudden triumph, but as accumulation of deliberate choices honored daily. When she took his hand, it was without ceremony, yet the gesture held more meaning than their wedding vows ever had. They had learned each other not through promise, but through consequence. As night closed around the estate, Ashbourne House stood unchanged in stone, yet transformed in spirit. What began as a marriage of defense had become one of deliberate devotion, forged through restraint tested and fear relinquished. Society would remember the spectacle of their union, but not the courage that followed it. That knowledge belonged to them alone. In choosing truth over safety, they had claimed something rarer than approval, a partnership grounded not in duty enforced, but in honor willingly shared, enduring, quietly, together.